This is the story of how the deadliest pandemic in human history became the greatest money-making opportunity of the Middle Ages, and how the men in the bird masks helped strip dying cities of their wealth. The Black Death, the bubonic plague, killed somewhere between a third and half of Europe when it arrived in 1347. And while it was killing, a whole industry of healers, quacks, and opportunists was quietly getting rich off the terror. You know the plague doctor. The long black robe, the waxed coat, the wooden cane, and that unmistakable beaked mask stuffed with dried flowers and herbs. Pop culture has turned that silhouette into a Halloween costume. But strip away the costume, and what you find underneath is far more interesting and a lot less heroic. Because for every genuine physician trying to help, there was a swarm of frauds who understood one simple thing: a frightened person will pay anything. And nobody in history was more frightened than a family watching the plague come up their street. Let's start with the demand, because that's what made the whole scheme possible. When the plague arrived in a town in 1348, medieval medicine had no answer for it, none. The best minds in Europe still believed in the four humors, the ancient idea that your body was governed by four fluids, and that illness meant those fluids had fallen out of balance. Under that theory, the plague wasn't caused by fleas or rats or a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. It was caused by bad air, corrupted by rotting matter, throwing your whole system into chaos. That was the official science, and it was completely, tragically wrong. But here's the thing about being wrong. When nobody knows the real answer, every answer sounds equally plausible. And that is the perfect environment for a con. If a man in a mask tells you that a pomander of rose petals and amber will keep death away from your door, and you have no way to prove otherwise, and your children are sleeping in the next room, you buy the pomander. You buy two. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe, there's a lot more coming. So the money started flowing, and it flowed in three directions. The first was the cure trade. When the plague hit, apothecaries and self-appointed healers began selling remedies at prices that would make your eyes water. Theriac, a thick medicinal paste that could contain dozens of ingredients, including opium and viper flesh, was marketed as a universal antidote and sold for enormous sums. Powdered gemstones, crushed pearls, ground up emeralds mixed into a drink, vinegar tonics, dried toads pressed against the swellings, bezoar stones, which were nothing more than hardened lumps of undigested material pulled from the stomach of a goat, changed hands for the price of a small farm. None of it worked. All of it sold. And the sicker the city got, the higher the prices climbed, because desperation has no ceiling. The second direction was the service itself. This is where the plague doctor, as we picture him, actually enters the story. Many towns, terrified and short of physicians, began hiring dedicated plague doctors, men contracted specifically to treat the infected when everyone else had fled. Cities like Venice and Florence left us some of the most detailed surviving records of these contracts, and they tell a story that is equal parts grim and fascinating. And on paper, this looks noble. In practice, it was a seller's market unlike anything medieval Europe had ever seen. Think about the leverage these men had. Every real doctor in the city had already run for the countryside. The plague doctor was, quite literally, the only medical help left. So when a town council sat down to negotiate a contract, they weren't negotiating from strength, they were begging, and the surviving contracts show it. One of the earliest documented cases is Giovanni de Ventura, a plague doctor whose contract with the city of Pavia is one of the clearest examples we have of just how badly towns needed these men and how much they were willing to pay for them. Cities agreed to pay these doctors' salaries far beyond what a normal physician earned. They threw in free housing, living expenses, and in some cases, a pension for the doctor's family if he died on the job. Some doctors negotiated to be paid whether the patient lived or died, which removed any real incentive to succeed. A few demanded their full fee up front in gold before they would even enter a house. And once inside that house, the leverage only grew. Because now it wasn't a town council on the other side of the table. It was a single, terrified family watching their father gasp on a bed, being told by the one man who might save him that the treatment would cost extra. Historians who've studied the period describe exactly this pattern. Fees that ballooned once the doctor was in the room, treatments stretched out over days to increase the bill, families pressured into paying for procedures that everyone, including the doctor, knew were useless. That's the second stream, and it shades directly into the third, which is where the real ugliness lives. Outright extortion of the dead and the dying. When someone died of the plague, their property didn't just vanish. There were wills to witness, valuables in the house, debts to settle, heirs to notify, and in a collapsing city, the plague doctor was often one of the very few people still moving between houses, still crossing thresholds that everyone else was too afraid to touch. That access was worth a fortune. Some used it to charge steep fees simply to enter a home and confirm a death, knowing the family had no other option. Others, according to accounts from the period, were accused of far worse: taking bribes to falsify records, looting the homes of the dead while claiming to disinfect them, pressuring the sick into altering their wills in the doctor's favor, whispering to a dying man that a generous bequest might earn him better care or a cleaner conscience in his final hours. Now, I want to be honest with you because this channel doesn't do lazy history. There was no single organized syndicate, no secret guild of masked criminals dividing up the loot. The billion-dollar scam wasn't one grand conspiracy with a boardroom and a ledger. It was something in a way more disturbing. It was thousands of individual acts of fraud, gouging, and exploitation happening in city after city, year after year, all feeding on the same bottomless well of human fear. Add it all up across the whole of Europe, across decades of recurring outbreaks, and the wealth that changed hands under the banner of plague medicine was staggering. Not because one villain planned it, because an entire continent was too frightened to say no. And the mask, that famous beaked mask, fit right into the business model. The costume as we recognize it today is largely credited to Charles de Lorme, a French physician who formalized the design around 1619, though versions of the protective garb existed earlier. Remember, the doctors genuinely believed bad air carried the disease, so the beak was packed with herbs and flowers to filter it. But the mask did something else too. It hid the face. It turned an ordinary, often unqualified man into an anonymous figure of authority. You couldn't read his expression. You couldn't recognize him later in the market. You couldn't easily hold him accountable when the cure failed and your money was gone. Whether they intended it or not, the costume was the perfect uniform for a trade built on trust that could never be verified. So who were these men really? Some were genuine physicians doing their grim best in an impossible situation, and they deserve real respect. Guy de Chauliac, one of the most respected surgeons of the 14th century, stayed in Avignon to treat patients during the outbreak of 1348, even after contracting the disease himself, and left behind detailed clinical observations that shaped medicine for generations. Even Nostradamus, later famous for his prophecies, worked as a plague doctor in southern France, developing herbal remedies and hygiene protocols that were, by the standards of the time, genuinely forward-thinking. But for every Guy de Chauliac, there were many more who were something else entirely. Second-rate doctors who couldn't build a normal practice, barbers and tradesmen who saw a gap in the market, and outright charlatans with no training at all, who put on the robe because the robe was where the money was. In a city where half the population might die, nobody was checking credentials. The mask was the credential. The tragedy is that the fraud made everything worse. Every coin spent on powdered emeralds was a coin not spent on food, or on fleeing, or on the quarantine measures that actually did slow the disease. The word quarantine itself comes from the Italian quarantina, meaning 40 days, the period Venice mandated that ships wait offshore before docking during the outbreak. It was one of the few interventions that genuinely worked, But every family that mortgaged its future to pay a masked stranger was a family left destitute when the plague finally passed. The scam didn't just take money, it took the last resources of people who had almost nothing left, and it took them at the exact moment they were least able to defend themselves. And here's the part that should sit with you. This isn't really a medieval story. The plague doctor is just an old costume wrapped around a pattern that never actually went away. Fear creates desperation. Desperation creates demand. And demand, when nobody can tell the real cure from the fake one, will always attract people who are happy to sell you hope at a markup. We've seen it in every pandemic since, right up to the ones in living memory. The masks change, the miracle cures change, the prices change, the scam stays exactly the same. The men in the bird masks didn't invent that scam, they just wore the most memorable outfit while running it. And the next time you see that beaked silhouette treated as something spooky and fun, remember what it actually was for a great many of the people who wore it. Not a symbol of healing, a license to profit from the dying. Because in the worst catastrophe Europe had ever known, some people saw a graveyard and some people saw a gold mine.